I'm going to teach you how to master hard braking like a pro. Braking hard isn't just about slowing down, and most riders on track days are doing it completely wrong. Recently I explained this to one of my pupils, and I'm going to break down exactly what I taught him so you can do it too. Not only will this make you a lot faster on track, it's far safer and easier to do it. If you've ever seen someone make a mistake like this, or this, then stick around, because honestly this one tip could change how you ride forever. So let's dive in, see exactly what's holding you back and how to fix it. Now today, what I want to talk about is what I would call the danger zone. Now the danger zone for me is the edge of the tyre. Why is it the danger zone? Well, the reason is that is when you have the least amount of grip. When you're completely upright, you have the most amount of grip on a motorcycle, and as you turn into the corner, the grip gradually decreases. As you begin to turn into the corner, you have to release the brake more and more. Now the tricky part of this is understanding exactly where the safe part and the dangerous part is when you're braking. Now the safe part for me is the middle part of the tyre. So you can afford to have some lean angle and still have maximum brake pressure, but once you start going past that point, you have to begin to release the brake. This can be seen here in this suspension graph from when I was racing, where you can see as I begin to turn into the corner, the brake pressure is decreasing. Now when we're riding, this all happens incredibly fast, but what you need to think is as you're turning into the corner and you go past that lean angle where it's safe to have maximum brake pressure, you have to keep releasing the brake. It's not quite as simple as this, but in my mind I want you to visualize that every 1 degree extra of lean angle you have, that's 1% more of brake pressure you need to be releasing. I've had a lot of guys message me on Instagram saying that they've seen motorcycle racers braking really hard all the way into the corner. And how can they possibly have full brake pressure at the apex? Now no bike rider has maximum brake pressure at the apex. If you do that, you're very likely to lock the front wheel. Where motorcycle racers do have full brake pressure is in the initial and mid part of the braking. They then begin to turn into the corner, and as they're turning in, they still have full brake pressure at this point, but as the lean angle increases, they have to release the brake all the way to the apex. Now for newer riders or people that don't understand this as well, you'll feel as you begin to turn in that the bike doesn't want to go in, and at that point that's when you need to start releasing the brake. If you ignore these feelings and these signs that you're getting that your bike doesn't want to turn in and do something drastic with a lot of brake pressure, that's when you're going to lose the front. The principle of this is exactly the same for accelerating, but I'm going to do a whole new video on that too. Now there's a lot to take in this video, so if any of it is confusing, make sure you check out my online course where I talk through everything about track day riding. From what lines to take, how to overtake, getting your knee down, and everything else in between, from track day novice to track day expert. I'm going to talk you through Dan here. Now Dan is the bike that's furthest in front, and as you can see, as we're approaching this corner, I'm going to catch him quickly on the brakes. When you brake harder upright, you've got far more control because you know that you're going to stop earlier, and then you can gauge your speed using the front brake as you turn into the corner. So you'll see here how much I'm able to catch him in a straight line on the brakes, and this is perfectly safe. This is the easiest place to catch someone because I'm upright. The worst thing that's going to happen to my bike is the back wheel will begin to lift off the floor, and if it does, all I have to do is release the front brake and it'll bring it back down. So we'll see here how much I catch Dan. And now if I pause the video at this point, we're both traveling at the exact same speed. So now at this point, all I have to do is begin to release the brake as I turn into the corner, which means there's very little chance I'm going to crash because as I turn into the corner and I have less grip, I've got far less brake pressure, so I can't lock the front wheel. Dan, however, at this point, is just about to do the worst thing possible that I see guys on track days do, and that's release the brake far too early and rush into the corner. Now in Dan's mind, he's doing this because this is where he thinks he can go faster on track. He's already told me before this that this is where he's confident because he always catches riders in this area. And the reason he's catching riders in this area is because he's doing it completely wrong, unfortunately. But what most riders do on track is attack the places that they're most confident. And unfortunately for Dan, that means in this very, very small section of track, which is the last bit of the braking phase, he's trying to find the most amount of time. When the reality is that biggest part of time to be found is coming off the corner, down the straight, and in the safe part of the braking zone. Generally, on track, Track day riders aren't that much slower in the middle of the corner than a professional racer, but where they are slower is when you're upright braking, trailing the brakes into the corner, and then accelerating out the corner. In the middle phase of the corner, there's only so fast a motorcycle will go. So we'll see here, as I'm slowing down safely, what Dan does. And that is release the brake. And as he's released that brake and accelerated away from me, he's now missed the apex. But where this becomes an issue and actually makes it really dangerous is when there's other riders in front of you. I will say in this video, I think this guy was actually running wide himself, but the point remains the same. We're now coming onto the back straight. And what's funny about this clip is when I showed this Dan afterwards and didn't say anything, he actually couldn't believe that the rider in front of him jammed the brakes on and nearly made him crash. But the reality is, what this rider was doing was actually correct. So they're more or less travelling at the same speed at this point, but Dan begins to brake. As he's only braking softly at this point, he's not really slowing down. So at this point, the rider in front is now beginning to slow down quite quickly. And this is where Dan is going to run into trouble, because as he begins to release the brake and rush into the corner, he's got no control whatsoever over his speed. So now he's releasing the brake, and you see how close that was to him running into the back of someone. The other problem with riding like this is as you start leaning into the corner and you're going into the danger zone on the edge of the tyre, if you need to slow down more, the only way you can do that is by squeezing the brake harder. And now as you're turning in too fast and you squeeze the brake even harder, there's a much higher chance that you're going to lose the front. It's far safer to brake harder upright when you've got lots of grip than to brake harder when you're leant over turning into the corner. There's two more really important sections of this video that I'm going to get into next. Firstly, it's the lines that people use on track. Then secondly, it's going to be a real pro tip that when you're already at lean angle approaching a corner, how do you approach braking then? Firstly, the lines, and this was something that was really important for Dan that I'm going to show you now. Dan was really guilty of not using enough of the track, and the problem when you do that is it upsets the lean angle that you need to use to brake. A really good example of this is the triple right-hander at Almeria. Now a lot of riders are really guilty there of riding round in the middle of the track. It's quite a tricky section and it's difficult to know exactly where you should be. I always teach riders when they're riding around there to join the dots. So you start at the first curb, you ride all the way to the second curb, back to the third curb and out to the fourth curb. And the reason I get people to do that is it really changes the lean angle that you have on the approach to each corner. If you don't do that, what you actually do is ride round in the danger zone, which is fine when you're just on a constant throttle or a constant brake pressure, but when you're trying to brake hard, you can't physically do that. Braking hard is something you really need to do for the last section of this corner. This was a new track for Dan, and it's always tricky when you arrive at a new track to know exactly where you needed to go. So by the second day, I was really forcing him to try and use more of the track to help his braking. You can see the difference that makes at the last right-hander when you can then get your bike upright to brake harder quickly before you need to release the brake again to turn into the corner. Now this is the same for pretty much every corner on all race circuits. You want to start on the outside of the track with your wheels as close to the white line as you can get them and initiate that really hard braking that we're talking about. The reason you need to start at the outside of the track is that gives you far more time with less lean angle as you begin to turn into the corner. Effectively meaning that you can be in the safer part of the tyre and not in the danger zone whilst you're braking. If you start a lot tighter to the corner and ride down the middle of the track, at the point where you need to keep squeezing the brake, you actually have to start releasing it because you've got far more lean angle earlier in the corner. You need to really think about that with every corner you approach. Of course, there's exceptions to every single rule, especially at Almeria, as there are actually some sections of the track where you don't use all of it on the approach. But for your typical hairpin 90-degree corner, that is how you should be approaching your braking. But now for the pro tip. As I said, there's exceptions to every rule, and I'm teaching you here to be really aggressive in the initial part of the braking phase. Now the exceptions to this rule is 1, when the conditions are wet or damp or cold and slippery, then you need to be a lot more careful in that initial phase of your braking. Now the way you do that is by loading the tyre more gently initially. When the conditions are really hot and sticky, you can brake pretty much as hard as you want to initially, and the only thing that's going to happen is the back wheel begins to lift off the floor, as I said earlier. But what happens when it's cold or wet is when you first grab the front brake, there isn't enough load on the front tyre and it will lock the front wheel in a straight line. That's something that's very, very difficult to get out of. You have to have cat-like reflexes to release the brake fast enough to unlock the front wheel. And to be honest, a lot of the time that's just more luck than judgment if you do manage to do that. So the important thing when it's wet is to make sure you're braking harder upright, but making sure you're loading the front initially. The next part of this pro tip is when you're approaching a corner where you're already at lean angle when you're accelerating. Now there's a corner like this at Almeria where you go up and over a blind crest. Then as I approach that left-hander there, without realizing it, I close the throttle, and there's a split second where as I close the throttle, I'm letting the front suspension load up before I grab the front brake. In corners where I'm approaching them upright, I brake really hard initially, and there's very little time between me closing the throttle and grabbing the front brake. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.